So God's will for our lives is comparable to the laws He has built for this universe, with this exception. Those laws are general, but the will of God that He has planned is specific for each and every one of us. To be sure, there are some things that must be true for all Christians. Firstly, it is God's will that we yield ourselves to Him. It is God's will that all Christians should rejoice, pray, and thank God. Every commandment in the Bible addressed to believers is part of the will of God that we must obey. See, God does not call each of us to the same work in life. He doesn't call us all to the same gifts and ministry while we're here on earth. The will of God is tailor-made for each and every one of us. The will that God has for Raymond is going to be different to the will of God has for Peter. Every will of God for His children is tailor-made to suit you and I. It is important that we have the right attitude toward the will of God. Some people think God's will is a cold, impersonal machine. God gets the machine up and running, then it's up to us to keep it going. And they believe that if we disobey Him in some way, that this machine will grind to a halt and that we are out of God's control. But church, I want to remind you this evening that God's will is not a cold, impersonal machine. See, you and I do not determine God's will in some mechanical way. It's not like getting a can of Coke from the vending machine. But the will of God is a living relationship between God and us as believers. The relationship is not destroyed when the believer disobeys, for the Father still deals with His child even if He must chasten him or her. Church, rather than looking at the will of God as a cold, impersonal machine, I prefer to see it as a warm, growing, living body. You see, if something goes wrong with my body, I don't die. But rather the body begins to compensate until that organ works properly again. Yes, there is going to be pain. Yes, there might be weakness. But there is not necessarily death. You see, when you and I get out of God's will, it is not the end of everything. Yes, we may suffer. Yes, there may be pain, but when God cannot rule, He overrules. Just as the body compensates for the malfunctioning of one part, so God adjusts things to bring us back to His will.